One of the things that we like here at Radical Engagements is an author who actually engages with the seeming failures and fads of the left. Now, there's a lot of caveats to that. We don't even agree on what the left is. The left is always a contested movement. And there are a lot of fads today that are very different than fads 5 or 10 years ago that are predictable from fads 5 or 10 years ago, which would probably make the people who hold them somewhat suspect, just like Euro communism led to Domenico Lacerda's Hegelian neo-Stalinism, and the new left led to the new communist movement. Today's anti-revisionist sectarian milieu on Twitter, where Stalin becomes a signifier for nearly everything and anything, in some ways is a logical response to the failure to deal with the problems of social democracy that came up in the middle of the aught teens, which itself was a logical response to the failure to deal with the lack of institutions encouraged by Occupy and aughts anti-war movement. Although today the anti-war movement, despite its Marxist-Leninist gloss, is pretty much the same as the one in the aughts, and it's about as effective so far. Even if it manages to spoil things for the Democrats, and by the time this is released, you will know if that had happened. And more power to them if they do, I suppose. We don't know what other effects have. It's not like it's fundamentally changed the logic of the American system. But this brings me to Medicare for All and the work of Benjamin Studebaker. And what I like about Ben is that he's really honest about the structural limitations of most of these political movements in the United States and the seeming crisis of legitimacy that has emerged out of it. And his two books are really about that. This short piece of Salation magazine is not a magazine I read a whole lot these days, but this came out and I thought it was quite good. And it gives us a way to talk about this problem of time periodization that probably does hit home for a lot of people. So let's go to the article. Medicare for All, Requiem for a Dream by Benjamin Studebaker. Let's make this larger and maybe a little bit less loud. This overly saturated layout here. All right. Nobody seems to care about Medicare for All anymore. The remnants of the millennial left have largely abandoned the issue, focusing instead on COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, trans rights, abortion, and the crisis in Palestine. I would arguably say this is a larger deal than just the millennial left. It's also the Zoomer left, which is a much smaller phenomenon than the millennial left, despite what you might get from Twitter. They say they can walk and chew gum, but the energy around M4A has collapsed. And I think that's interesting because we must remember part of the logic of why M4A was a wedge issue is that it was clear that the American medical system was in some dire straits in terms of cost that the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was supposed to address, and it didn't. And not only has the energy around Medicare for All collapsed, the energy around even fixing the ACA has collapsed, except in conservative circles. Politicians in both parties no longer feel they need to even pretend to be interested in it. Yeah, they realize that they won and they don't have to hide that anymore. These days, they actively guard against any such association. Kamala Harris has formally backed away from Medicare for All. She clearly is ashamed to have been associated with it ever so briefly in 2019. And I think we have to look at the electoral logic here. When Democrats are out of power, they need to shore up their base. And to do that, they often actually will rhetorically pivot towards the left and maybe even throw left-wing bones, Walter Mondale / Joe Biden style, to various different old left factions to keep them in the coalition, but they will not be passing systemic progressive policies, much less democratic socialist ones. Now, that gambit's as old as time and was only really a drop from the rise of the Atari Democrats to the DNC. The Atari Democrats started in the late 70s with the ascension of Gary Hart to the Senate, and with the neoliberalizing project of the Carter administration really going into full tow, which is picked up, accelerated, and solidified under Reagan, but is not Reagan's project. Don't let David Harvey fool you. Nonetheless, Donald Trump openly makes fun of inferior socialist government-run healthcare systems, which that's the fact that has any purchase today is kind of laughable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez suggested M4A might ultimately be a little more than a negotiating tactic for adding a public option to the Affordable Care Act, which they haven't even gotten close to doing. I just want to add that out. There's little reason to think that a handful of sitting members of Congress endorsed by the Democratic Socialists or the Justice Democrats still considered a priority or even a goal. And that's despite what Jimmy Dore and co wanted them to do with the parliamentary / congressional check of forcing the vote. Not that that would have changed it anyway. As an aging, decrepit millennial leftist who sincerely believes in Medicare for all is necessary to make socialism possible in the United States, disagrees me. I would actually go so far. Hell, Medicare for all would make capitalism more viable in the United States, like it is, like such programs are in many places that are economically prosperous. The exception does seem to be the NHS, but part of that is because of Britain squandering the way it has decided to deal with its post-imperial period after the 1970s, no longer being able to leverage that prior imperial cachet as a head of finance capital to be able to get good deals with EU labor. And that's their own fault. Anyway, if after reading this piece you want to vote for Harris or Trump or any of the other people who are never ever going to move us even a half step in the direction of Medicare for all, go right ahead. I know nothing I can say will stop you. But as for me, to tell you the truth, I don't care who wins. I kind of don't either. People, I used to think that maybe it would be better if Harris won, but I don't. I honestly, I feel like the way this entire election cycle and Biden coalition has played out, it's hard to see who would care. And one of the reasons why I wanted to, by the time I release this, that we will know the outcome of the election. But like, it's just hard to give a shit at this point. Palestine, the way the primaries were handled, the way Trump's policies were normalized under Biden and even rationalized, that's hard for me to get on board with. It's hard for me to take anyone who thinks Trump is that dangerous super seriously when they've already rationalized a lot of his program. It's clear to me that we've lost, and that's what really matters. Yep. Yeah, we did lose. Why M4A? The simplest reason Medicare for all matters is the millions of Americans who have no access to health care. Still, in 2024, a good decade and some odd after the implementation of Obamacare and more than a decade after its passing, there are 27 million Americans who have no insurance at all. But beyond that, we have a two-tier system in this country. Many of the most successful doctors refuse to see patients who are on affordable plans, as those insurers don't reimburse at the highest rates. Nearly 30% of physicians don't accept Medicare patients, and many Obamacare plans have extraordinarily small networks. Yeah, I don't hear that talked about a lot either. There are 72 million Americans on Medicaid and around 45 million on Obamacare. Only that many? These Americans have insurance, but their insurance is not equal to that of the American or Medicare or employer-based schemes. The three categories, uninsured, Medicaid, and Obamacare, include 144 million people. That's a little less than half of the U.S. population. And I want to put that in perspective. Also, I hate to be a person who points this out, but employer-based plans have gotten significantly worse in the period after the ACA. And I know that's an unpopular thing to say. There are things that are better. I remember having to deal with in my early 20s the problems of pre-existing conditions and trying to prove that you had coverage so that your pre-existing conditions would fit in, which was another loophole from 80s insurance reforms. But let's be quite frank here. The ACA initial success was actually poison pilled by some of the restrictions put on it by the Supreme Court, even though that was seen as a victory because they didn't totally reverse it. And there were flaws in the bill which the Democrats were aware of and have said they were going to fix and never did. There are 67 million Americans on Medicare. The remaining 300 million Americans are insured through employers. This other half, the half that's on ostensibly good plan, faces other problems. Thank you. As the cost of quality health care rises, although that rise is slowing in comparison to everything else after Biden, that's actually a funny side effect. Employers face even higher healthcare costs for their employees. The rise of healthcare costs eats wage growth. Expanding paychecks, employers maintain the levels of healthcare provision. In some cases, they pay even more as the quality of coverage declines. I've seen that myself. But any case, the cost of healthcare still registers statistically as an increase in employers' compensation. Employee compensation technically, I said employee compensation. Employee compensation technically rises as healthcare costs go up and take-home pay stagnates. Yeah, Andrew Kleiman actually made this argument over a decade ago about why we just looking at wages and not total compensation packages is misleading on the left. He was right. That means that rising healthcare costs slowly undermine the ability of employees to buy houses or pay for children. And we see that both, and that's not even dealing with the housing cost increase. And yet, if you look at compensation statistics, they will appear to be improving all the while. Yep, because all of it's going into healthcare, which, by the way, is why a lot of millennials aren't going to get a lot of baby boomer wealth because the hospitals are going to claw back too. And who owns those hospitals? Where a lot of them are owned by the universities. You know, the same universities that are major landlords in almost every major city, if not the main. And whom have had all these frightful debacles around Palestine. Anyway, if the employee quits or starts their own business, they have to relinquish this high quality insurance, which, by the way, is often not all that super high quality anymore. I think Studebaker is somewhat overstating the quality of this insurance, but not in terms of cost. It creates a relationship with dependent. It reduces their leverage and making it harder for them to change jobs or unionize or go out on their own. This makes the employee weak and easier to dominate. And it's a counter. Decline of the workforce in raw numbers, which should favor the worker. So, for the 1.44 million Americans who have no insurance or are poorly insured, M4A improves access to healthcare. And for the 134 million Americans who are relatively strong insurance, relative being key there, M4A increases their autonomy at work and allows for wage growth. I know people who I work with at schools who actually work for Teamster jobs at night to maintain healthcare for their spouses. Like, I totally see this. By removing this source of stress and anxiety, M4A increases the capacity of Americans in both groups to focus their energy on other issues in their lives, both political and social. Americans will be able to think better about the wider variety of things if they don't have to worry about healthcare. They will be more able to organize and they will be less reactive. All of this would improve the quality of public debate. It would strengthen society. Now, there's something I want to see if Ben gets to, and part of why I don't think this happens, and because it would actually save employers money too, and it would cut the cost of healthcare for the government, because our government pays more to handle all these tax rebates and pay for and subsidize for indigent care or whatever than it would if it just socialized the care, which I know takes a lot of people a little bit to wrap their mind around, but it's definitely the case. But there's a couple of reasons why it didn't happen, and maybe we'll get to that. But this is one part of what makes M4A so important. The private healthcare system puts patients in a difficult situation. If you don't purchase healthcare, you die. Well, not exactly that, but close. You don't really have an option to say no. In other areas of the economy, if someone offers you a bad deal, you can buy something else. If apples are too expensive this week, you can buy oranges instead. But if you need chemotherapy, there is no good substitute you can buy. Either you buy the chemotherapy at whatever ultimate price, or you die, an asterisk. And you can't know the price ahead of time, which is actually different than other countries who have a free market healthcare system. The United States healthcare system is not actually a market by any meaningful definition, because there's no clear pricing except in certain states that make pricing transparency mandatory, but those are done by a state-by-state regulation. Insurance companies try to help control the cost by pooling patients together. In theory, they negotiate on behalf of the patients with healthcare practices. But in practice, the more insurance companies there are, the harder it is for insurance companies to control cost. And if there's a smaller number of big insurance companies, then the insurers begin taking a larger cut for themselves, which is what we see. With private insurance systems, either the providers are too strong or the issuers are too strong, but the patients who need to buy healthcare to avoid death have no leverage and always end up overpaying either for the insurance or in their portion of the bill that's given to them after insurance coverage. You're going to pick your poison, but you're going to get fucked either way. The consequence of this is that in the United States, the healthcare sector has ballooned to 70% of the GDP. The United States has a GDP of 29 trillion. That means the healthcare sector accounts for nearly 5 trillion of US GDP. In 1960, the healthcare was less than 5% of US GDP. And in 1960, the United States had a GDP of just 542 billion in current USD. That means the entire healthcare sector was roughly 27 billion. That's adjusted for inflation, people. The US population in 1960 was 179 million, which means that in the 1960 healthcare accounted for roughly 150 million per 1 million people. Today, there are about 345 million Americans. I've seen less estimates that are less than that, but okay, we'll just stick with that. Which means today that healthcare accounts for about 14.4 billion per 100 million people. That's 42 times more expensive relative to the population. And let's be clear, that's adjusting for inflation. Yeah, like I said, he adjusted for inflation already. Now the population has gotten older. New medical technologies are more expensive, and there's a good reason to invest in healthcare to improve outcomes. Some increases in healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP have been warranted between 1960 and 2024. Every other major developed country saw an increase in relative size of their healthcare sector, but no country saw the sector growth to 17% of GDP. Canada and UK have a healthcare sector that commands roughly 11%. Denmark's system is just under 10%. Norway's system is a touch under 9%. In most of these countries, the system was created when the sector was still small. And then over the course of the last half century, there was a managed expansion. That's actually a problem for America, though. We'll get to it. And I'm sure Ben will too. It is clearly possible to provide quality health care to all Americans for something like 12% of the GDP. The United States is much richer on a per capita basis than the UK or Canada. A healthcare sector that's 12% of the US GDP would be significantly better resourced. Now, we're richer per capita, but we're more unevenly distributed than Canada or the UK, and not like those places are particularly low Gini coefficient countries either. The objective in the United States would be to manage the contraction of the sector, not the expansion. This is why we need a single payer system. Only a unitary payer with monopoly power to fix reimbursement rates can force the sector to contract. Between 17% of US GDP and 12%. That's roughly 1.5 trillion in potential social savings. However, you have to do with something with all these services and medical services that are tied into it. It actually would affect the economy. There's no way around that. And that part of the economy has been a growth stage for lower middle class jobs, particularly in areas hit by deindustrialization. See the work of Gabriel Winamp for more discussion of this. So it's a problem on two levels. Objections and responses. Objection one: funding research and development. Now, you might argue that 12% isn't good enough. Perhaps you feel that the United States needs to play a leading role in global medical research, and that extra money that Americans surrender to the healthcare sector is necessary for the United States to continue to play that role. You might, maybe you think that the United States is effectively subsidizing all the other healthcare systems in the world. I used to believe that, actually, by absorbing the cost of research and development. And you think that this is a good and noble thing, something that should continue even at the high costs and stark inequities of the system weakens the American worker and pushes down American life expectancy. Yeah, I mean, you should be like, yeah, the American life expectancy is declining in an age of radical healthcare. Response: most drug companies spend more money on marketing than they do research. In 2013, 9 out of the top 10 drug companies spent more on marketing. And even in 2020, during the pandemic, 7 of the top 10 spent more on advertising. Johnson & Johnson, which developed one of the major COVID vaccines, spent $22 billion on sales and marketing in 2020 compared to just $12 billion on research. Prohibiting drug companies from wasting social resources on ads would in itself free up an enormous amount of money for research. All told, in 2020, just $245 billion was spent on medical research. Given that the U.S. healthcare sector is roughly $5 trillion in size, it seems very unlikely that it is truly necessary to spend 17% of GDP to get $245 billion in research funding. If you think that the U.S. should spend more to encourage for the research, this could be done within the framework of a much smaller healthcare sector. Say we decide to boost the sector from 12% to 14%, and we ensure that the 2% boost was entirely in R&D. That would be worth $580 billion, which would be more than double what is currently spent. A healthcare sector at 14% of GDP would still be $870 billion smaller, leaving almost $1 trillion to be socially reallocated. Objection: unemployed healthcare workers. This one's one that I think is a little bit more serious. Whether you want a healthcare sector that's 12% of GDP or 14, there's also a question of what to do with a very large number of people who are currently wasting their lives doing unnecessary administrative work for insurance companies, drug companies, and hospitals. Rapidly contracting that sector in a reckless and irresponsible manner would leave these people without jobs. That is true. However, there's a caveat there, and we need to talk about that caveat, and Ben's going to give it to us. Bernie Sanders had two ideas here. One was to help these workers learn new skills by making public colleges tuition free. Yeah, lovely. Good idea. Way to go for you. Wouldn't happen fast enough. That would cost the federal government $50 to $100 billion per year, depending on how much of the burden is borne by the states. Then there is the jobs guarantee, which was to provide workers exiting the bloated healthcare sector with new opportunities in other sectors. This was something of a public policy trident. You get rid of the bloat in healthcare, you can use the job programs to ensure immediate stability for workers exiting that sector, and offer cheap higher education so that the workers can explore further possibilities in the long term. That assumes that there are further possibilities there, though, which there may not be. The administrative jobs in the healthcare sector pay well, but they are unnecessary and meaningless. They're true bullshit jobs. A lot of bullshit jobs are not actually bullshit. This one is. It's bullshit because it's bullshit beyond their mandate by law. Let me rephrase that. A lot of this is mandated by the clunky way we handle the legal accountability here. By replacing them, we would help the bureaucrats make a real contribution to society. Yeah, that doesn't really answer the question, though. I do agree that this is kind of still a false dilemma, but I actually don't think that response is particularly persuasive. Objection: the fiscal dilemma. What about the cost? While Medicare for All strikes the size of the employee sector, reducing a social burden, its burden on patients and employers, it does this by increasing the state's role in the sector, increasing the burden of the system of the state. The more we shrink the sector to make it affordable for the state in the long term, the more workers in the sector will become unemployed and adjustment costs will be higher. Conversely, if you avoid shrinking the sector to limit adjustment costs, the long-term cost of the system will be very onerous indeed. response. Currently, the United States government spends around $944 billion on Medicare and $805 billion on Medicaid, along with $125 billion in Obamacare subsidies. The Obamacare subsidies are much lower than I thought. This means nearly 40% of that sector is already in state hands. If the goal is to reduce the total size of the sector by 3 to 5% of GDP, the annual expenditure needs to be roughly 3.5 to 4 trillion. That means what's needed is around 1.5 to 2 trillion in additional payment annual revenue plus adjustment cost. Bernie Sanders proposed to raise the funds by taxing businesses and individuals on the premise that the tax will be smaller than the social savings that businesses and individuals would stand to experience. They don't have to pay for the health care anymore. I mean, you got to factor that in, and people don't. You'd be able to use his healthcare cost calculator to see the tax hike will be smaller than your savings. Then the proposed to add to some taxes on the wealthy, bringing our top tax rate closer to alignment with the other OECD competitors. As you might expect, this was part of the proposal that drove opposition to the plan from outside the healthcare sector. This resistance from capital needs to be overcome politically for M4A to become possible. In this sense, M4A not only alleviates human suffering and unlocks reserves of time energy for social and political organizing, it is itself an expression of the struggle to politically overcome capital, even from within capitalism itself. The more funding M4A gets from taxing capital, the more difficult it is for M4A from within the framework of capitalism. There is then a political question rather than an M4A should be funded in a manner that makes it more attractive to capital. Reasonable socialists can disagree about this. If you cater too much to capital, the social savings for workers will be smaller than they could and should be. But if you insist that M4A can be achieved completely and totally against the capitalists, then it can only be achieved along with socialism. That would negate its potential as a non-reformist reform, as a capitalist reform that improves social conditions, unlocking further higher forms of organizing. Sanders proposed to form Medicare for all in a moderate way that balanced between these concerns. There's room to argue for altering the balance a bit one way or the other, but the balance is clearly necessary if M4A is to be a political feasible medium term, aka if it's worth being in a minimum program or a transitional program. All right, things that we should demand before the overcoming capital. Which, by the way, since most of the OECD nations already do this, it's not hard to ask. The way in which M4A is implemented fiscally should be sensitive to the macroeconomic context. Transitional provisions should be more generous in periods of stagnation or recession and more conservative during a boom. If M4A is pursued at a time when the economy is overheating and there is a need to reduce inflation, unemployment generated during the transition is a counter-inflationary. It enables the Federal Reserve to avoid interest rate hikes that it might otherwise implement to create unemployment, which is, by the way, what they're really doing when they do interest rate hikes. It's not about savings like you were told during the Volcker shock. That's been definitively disproven by the history of the 1980s. Conversely, if M4A is to be pursued at a time when the economy is struggling and there's a need for fiscal stimulus, a period in which the gap between federal spending and federal revenue rapidly increases can provide a stimulus that enables the Federal Reserve to avoid lowering rates or engaging in large amounts of quantitative easing. The system should be implemented in a manner that reduces dependence on monetary policy and on the Federal Reserve. This would have had the added benefit of reducing the public's reliance on technocrats to manage economic disturbances. Objection going through the states. Some have argued there's a need to prove that M4A can work before it can be possible to overcome political resistance from capital. They suggested, I'm just going to say stupidly, that M4A should be tried at a state level. There was in 2018 an effort by the gubernatorial candidate in Michigan, Abu El-Sayed, to implement M4A at the state level. El-Sayed lost that election, but someone else might try it. There's something like these things floating, for example, in California and New York, just like expanding Massachusetts healthcare from its precursor to the ACA could be helpful. Now, I say this, there's one big problem with this, it's obvious, and that is states have no power over currency. But let's see what Studebaker says. If he doesn't touch this, I'll go into it. The problem with state pilot programs is that A4A works on the premise that there is a single payer, not 50 payers. Okay, that's not the only reason why it doesn't work, but I think this is fair enough. Individual states do not have sufficient leverage to push down the cost of the system. So when a U.S. state tries to implement M4A at the state level, it discovers the costs are enormous. Yeah, plus, there's all these kinds of, you know, regulatory drift and internal market capture stuff and capital movement between states is pretty well known. So when a U.S. state typically raises a much smaller amount of revenue per capita than the federal government. Yep. Also, they can't issue currency to mitigate that either. They do not raise enough money to fund even a modest healthcare system, let alone a system equipped to compete with the private system in other U.S. states. The result can only be both ballooning budget deficits and a shortage of healthcare workers, which we already have, by the way. We have a shortage of healthcare workers now, as high-quality medical practitioners relocate to U.S. states where the reimbursement rates are higher. Pilot programs in U.S. states will fail, and when they fail, they undermine the credibility of M4A as a federal solution. M4A only works as a federal policy. Yeah, and it does for a reason beyond what Studebaker is saying here. You need the ability to control your currency, and I don't mean this. You don't have to be a modern monetary theorist to believe this, although they do, and they're right. When you can issue your own currency, you can actually decide a whole lot about how these costs are felt, you know. Whereas when you're not implementing your own currency, you're actually at the behest of federal policy, in addition to what Studebaker just brought up, which he's completely right about. But it just means that you're really, really vulnerable. And it's because of that, it's also defeating to the policy. This means that the easiest way for insurance companies, drug companies, hospitals to defeat Medicare for All is to persuade foolish people to try a policy at the state level. Unfortunately, many in the Sanders movement do not understand how policy works or why it works. I mean, you know, they don't understand a lot of stuff. That's also why they get duped into other sectarian politics that's based on vibes. So there's always a danger that that this would be tried. Thankfully for us all, Abu El-Said was defeated. Yeah, but the program in California wasn't. But if that movement for M4A ever gains steam again in the future, others will be sure to pursue this dead end. Objection going through the Democratic Party. The Democrats aren't sincere about Medicare for All. In the 2020 campaign, many of their candidates pretended to be for a policy when the point of fact was they were using it as a slogan to describe a public option or something similar. This was a major problem with Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Andrew Yang, Elizabeth Warren, and others. These campaigns deliberately deceived voters about their intentions by using M4A rhetorically to provide cover for inferior plans. Buttigieg's Medicare for All Who Want It plan was especially insidious. I mean, I've actually complained about this period of DSA sloganeering. Medicare for All is one of them, where these policies were proposed in ways which could be weakened, while the rhetoric of those policies could be taken from them. And it wasn't just here. You saw it in abolish the police, moving to defunding the police. Abolishment was a much more radical thing than people even realized when they were proposing it. But defunding was actively kind of I don't know. I will maintain my thing that I think it was a problem that many people tried to justify and off of very lofty ideas about where that funding was actually going to go. Even the members of Congress who have been endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America or by the Dutch Democrats have at points indicated willingness to use M4A as a device to win Obamacare reforms. Yep, we see AOC. Many people did not understand the importance of prioritizing M4A. During the 2020 campaign, many of these people claimed they wanted to push Bernie left. In practice, that meant forcing Sanders to decenter Medicare for All and instead center the interests and concerns of establishment non-governmental organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, Black Lives Matter, Planned Parenthood, the NAACP, the National Organization for Women, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. These organizations that standardly donate to the Democratic Party establishment. In focusing on issues these organizations emphasize, the Democrats not only de-emphasize healthcare, but also polarize workers on racial, educational, sexual, and religious lines, which may be worth doing, by the way, but not on the expense of M4A. One of the few things that socialists can offer that can be done before the advent of socialism that would have a clear effect etc., etc. The effect of this was to create sharp cultural antagonism that made it much more difficult to effectively organize for anything. It also diminished the ability of the left to compete electorally in more socially conservative regions of the country, where M4A is popular, but many of these other issues are not. Uh, Many of these regions are poor and badly in need of the benefits of M4A, but the Democratic Party establishment continuously cast these Americans in the basket of deplorables. I mean, yes, in 2016, less so in 2020, but still. These are people whose votes you must not seek to win, lest secure the kind of legislative majority that might create an expectation that you follow through on M4A. I mean, the problem is if you actually win them, you create an expectation to follow through on any fucking thing at all. Not like the Democrats are known for following through on jack and shit, but nonetheless. Response. This is the objection to which we have yet no good response. While some, like Batya Ungar Sagan, have argued that the Republican Party might take up M4A after a realignment, it seems very unlikely that the same problems would simply be replicated in the Republican Party. That party has its own set of traditional funding sources, and they are every bit as disinterested in Medicare for all as the organizations that fund the Democratic Party. I mean, there's some like factory organizations and some about who wouldn't mind Medicare for all, but yeah, I doubt its donor base is a whole lot more sympathetic. The only way to get the two parties positively involved in the fight would be to create a new lines of financial dependence. Now, it is true for that many rich people in the United States would stand to benefit in the long term from a smaller healthcare sector. Yes, they would. That social savings could generate new investment opportunities outside the healthcare sector, leading to boons in housing or higher education. I mean, higher education is a different problem, and I don't have the same response here. But I think the logic is good. I think the caveats there are more complicated. The healthcare sector is bloated, as is actually higher education sector, in much the same way that the heavy industry was bloated in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's bloated in much the same way as construction sector is bloated in China today. Shh, don't tell people that, but it's true. It is. Huge amounts of capital are tied up in the sector that could be freed to roam. There is a real capitalist case for Medicare for all, even leaving aside the benefit for workers. But the benefit for workers is a weakening of employer power, which is something we often do not take into the case when we think about this. But I don't think most of our capitalists are operating at high enough level of analysis to appreciate the business opportunities M4A could create for them and the rest of the economy. No, that would require them to have long-term thinking, and they have shown themselves, due to buying back stock options and whatnot, fundamentally incapable of doing that, since most of their management can just jump to another team or another business and ruin it anyway after creating a brief boon for investors. Anyway, they are unfortunately considering it mainly in terms of immediate tax hikes that they would face. Well, I mean, since most of these people are short-term gaming the stock market, it would make sense that they would do that anyway. That means that those tax hikes would have to be moderate in scope if M4A is to be achieved under capitalism. The higher the taxes on capital, the more M4A will require independent social organizing by workers outside of the Democratic and Republican parties. Despite efforts to play up union organizing efforts, the percentage of workers in labor unions continues to decline. Thank you, Ben, for being honest about that. It's like you and me are some of the few people who are not blowing smoke up people's asses about this. It is now perilously close to dropping below 10%. Yep. Even though there's more union applications and there's more labor militancy, I think those are both true. The union applications are increasing in smaller and smaller shop venues and do not offset the decline of people in unions. And many of these unions are an appendage to the Democratic Party. Yep. They are slow to endorse Sanders, even failed to endorse him. And there is little reason to think their leaders are genuinely committed to Medicare for all now. No, I mean, it would actually weaken some of these unions' own bargaining with their own base if they did have Medicare for all, because some of them use healthcare bargaining as part of how they get people loyal to them. New forms of organization will be needed, not just to struggle against the Democrat or Republican establishments, but also to struggle against progressive movement that only pretend to be interested in achieving the goal. Yep. Which is why weird militant sectarians are a problem, but also they could be the answer to a lot of the problems that we see here today. Now, I say this, I have a much more leftward politics than But Medicare for All is one of the only things out of the panoply of the Bernie movement that I thought was really, 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 really fucking important. As a person who literally worked in Egypt during a counter-revolution to support a spouse who had cancer because I couldn't promise that I could otherwise. Yeah, I know what this means. The weaker the workers' level of organization, the more concessions will have to be made to the rich on funding mechanisms to secure their support. Objection, going through the capitalist state. Some will press this objection even further, arguing that M4A is the kind of policy that reveals the inadequacy of the capitalist modern state as a political form. I mean, I do kind of agree with that, but I'm still on Ben's team here. International capital mobility has made it progressively harder for states to raise tax revenues at the level necessary to create this kind of program. Yep. Money flees to tax havens in emerging markets when the tax man comes. Too often, the hypothetical possibility of capital flight is enough to silence these discussions before they even begin in earnest, particularly at the state level. As was pointed out by Ben above, our procedural understanding of democracy is itself increasingly an obstacle. Today, many states require political parties to nominate their candidates for office through primaries, and primaries leave any new party open to penetration by outside money. Yep, it does. But you won't find many people in the U.S. politics who call for abolishing primaries. I do. I actually do. But instead, much of the procedural discussion focuses on abolishing the Senate or judicial review. But of course, you can't do that until you have more local power at the state level. And the people who are calling for this because they don't have local power at the state level in most of the states. They only really have New York and California. These arguments only deepen antagonism between rural red states and the densely populated blue states. They exacerbate cultural struggles, making it even harder to work together. Many reformers are waiting for constitutional amendments that just aren't coming. In response, insofar as this objection holds, it shows how central M4A is to the struggle for socialism. In struggling for M4A, we are struggling to overcome the party system, perhaps even the modern state, or at least the modern capitalist state, as a political form. I think that modern capitalist state is actually a big deal. Developing our ability to meaningfully push for M4A possibly develops our abilities to do all these other things, and yet M4A is much more of a concrete objective than, say, socialism. I mean, yeah, but also socialism isn't even good enough. Ben, it's much easier to show people the good that it does, unburned by controversial legacy of state socialism in the Soviet Union, China, or elsewhere. I mean, we've decided to go the other route and just defend those as unproblematically and pretend that any discussion of the actual history of like conflicts between those societies that we mentioned there is somehow historical nihilism or some bullshit. And I say this as a person who's actually a Soviet defensist and a mild China defensist. All right. I'm not a person who thinks that there's nothing good in those societies. But I find the idea that our entire goal is to defend them while offering nothing domestically is absurd. And if all you're offering is the moral goodies of feeling good about getting out of the way of history or whatever, you're not offering shit. And you should probably think about the fact that your politics actually is not a politics because it requires people to do things where you're not. And for the people around you to just passively wait for that to happen eschatologically. All right. If this objection is too pessimistic, that means that M4A can be achieved through capitalist state and through the American two-party system. If M4A is compatible with the capitalism, after all, it doesn't make it bad. Yeah, I actually think it is compatible with capitalism because there's plenty of capitalist states that have socialized medicine. All right. Within the capitalist framework, M4A would be a non-reformist reform, whatever the fuck that means. I've never bought that framework. I would love for Ben to defend why he thinks we should use that weird phrasing. It would create conditions under which workers are less dependent on their employers. I mean, I agree about this. Less anxious about their futures and more able to think big about how to live full human lives. And it actually wouldn't even require expansions of imperial power. That's another thing that's funny about this one. All right. And few of them would drown in medical debt or die prematurely. There's also that. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, though, despite all this, why has this been dropped? Right? Why have almost any of these? I mean, most of what socialism is today is a historical defense society for societies that are elsewhere. And I do think some of those projects are worth doing. I don't want to sound like I'm totally shitting on them, but if that's all you're politically got, you don't have anything. I don't know what to tell you. There's not many reforms that I think would actually benefit people and also lead to something closer to socialism, but this is one of them. And yet it's the one. It's the one that we've dropped the most. If you had a platform, Medicare for all, improving K through 12 schooling, quit focusing on college so goddamn much, and ending imperialism, you could start to win people over. Yes, there are parts of the American working class that benefit from imperial gains, but a lot of the working class doesn't, or at least doesn't obviously. And these things, the things that I mentioned, are not things that are dependent on imperial power in the same way. Yeah, I can't get people to even take up that reformist project, a project that has been floated around since the fucking 1960s. In the 1940s, even, actually. By progressives, not even by socialists. And like I said, most of the reforms that leftists try, I actually think are a waste of time. This one's not one of them. And yet, and yet, and yet. But part of the problem is, if we're honest, we've been lied to about this by people who used it to keep us tied to a party that had no interest in ever doing this. And we kind of all know it. And that's how it got discredited. But Ben's right about the cost of that discreditedness. It's a loss. And the working class in America, be they black, Latin, or white, will continue to see their average life expectancy drop until we start handling it. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. This is Varn from the past talking to you in the future. However you feel about the way this election goes, this is something you should have cared about, and you dropped it. We all did. Why? Take care.